This is Yorkshire Television in colour.
Yorkshire in 1980 was a place where it felt like horror lurked around every corner. The country hadn't long moved out of a period of economic depression that saw the 70s referred to as the lost decade. The coal industry was shrinking, causing hardship for many communities where the mines were a backbone. Strikes and unemployment were high. Communities were tight-knit but anxious. And a big part of that anxiety in this area of the country was because the Yorkshire Ripper was still at large. From 1975 to 1980, a string of brutal murders had terrified the region. Women were being killed across West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester. Police were stretched thin. Trust in the authorities was eroding. Fear was constant. People were afraid of a very real evil walking down the streets of their towns, their villages, and no one knew if they would be next. The idea that something could happen in plain sight, something violent, something unnatural, didn't feel implausible, it felt inevitable. Playing away in the background during all of this was of course the Cold War. While this was not directly affecting the population for the most part, many point to it as creating a sense of paranoia throughout the country. People began looking to the skies, convinced of seeing Russian planes, or worse still, a bomb. The memories of World War II had not yet faded, but there were those who would claim to see things in the sky that they didn't believe were enemy craft. UFO fever had hit the UK, and throughout the 1970s, an increasingly high number of reports of unidentified flying objects were made. Strangely, Yorkshire appeared to be something of a hotspot for them, specifically the small town of Todmorden, a place that apparently had recorded 10% of all UFO sightings across Great Britain at the time. One afternoon, 2 police officers in this quiet, unassuming town received a call. A body had been found. They didn't know it, but they were about to be thrown into a case that would see all of these deep-rooted fears crashing together into one unbelievably strange mystery. A mystery that would see one of these officers experience something that to this day he could not explain. An experience that would totally destroy his life. Get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. It's time to get into one of the strangest unsolved mysteries of all time. This is the story of Zigmund Adamski. Welcome to the Tape Library. Just before we get into this one, I put out a post recently asking this question, but obviously not everyone sees those. I'm putting together my plan for the second half of the year, so if there's a topic that you really want me to cover, now is your chance to suggest it. Leave a comment below letting me know what you want to hear, and if you see a suggestion that you would like to see yourself, be sure to click like on those comments too, so I don't miss them. I have been fascinated by this story since I was a child. It was the very first segment of the pilot episode of Strange But True, back in 1993. For those who didn't grow up in the UK in the 90s, Strange But True was effectively our version of Unsolved Mysteries, and was responsible for giving many children nightmares, myself included. A show that I personally blame for why I now do this. I can't believe it has taken me this long to get around to this case, but here we go. It begins not in a place you'd expect a mystery, but in the quiet working class town of Todmorden, nestled in the Pennine Hills of West Yorkshire, England, a town of terraced houses, cobbled streets, and old mill buildings, unchanged for decades. The type of place where everyone knows everyone else, and secrets are hard to keep. But in the summer of 1980, a series of events would unfold in Todmorden that no one could explain. It started with a man who vanished, then a body found in a place it shouldn't have been. Then 5 months later, a police officer would claim to see something in the sky, something impossible, and from there, the story spirals. It was June when it all started. It was just before 4 p.m. when Trevor Parker, the son of the local coal yard owner, returned to the family business. The yard sat near the train station, not far from Todmorden town centre. He had been there earlier in the day but hadn't noticed anything unusual. But then, he saw something, and what he saw stopped him cold. In front of him was a large heap of coal, surrounded by the mess of the coal yard, tools and machinery. But from this angle he could see there was something on top of the pile, something that hadn't been there before. Laying face up on top of a 15-foot high heap of coal was the body of a man. He looked like he had just been placed there, carefully, deliberately. It was as though he had just appeared from nowhere. Trevor had never seen a dead body before. Once he regained his senses, he made a call to the local police station. Officer Malcolm Hagley was asked to head towards the train station that day, and he took with him another police officer by the name of Alan Godfrey. When they heard a body had been found, their minds undoubtedly went to the worst case scenario, had the Ripper descended upon their small town. But this victim was male, and when they arrived at the scene it was instantly clear that something odd had taken place. Malcolm awkwardly crawled up the coal pile first. It was difficult to do so. The police officer slid back down multiple times before reaching the top, covering his uniform in coal dust as he did. When he did finally get there, he instantly shouted down to Alan to come up. He said that Godfrey needed to see this. The dead man was in his 50s. He was wearing a suit jacket, but his shirt was missing, instead just having a stringed vest underneath his jacket. His watch and wallet were gone. His trousers were fastened strangely. Similarly, his shoes and socks were on, but like they had awkwardly been placed onto his body. The man looked well groomed. His facial hair was only a day old. There were some small scrapes and cuts on his hands, but it was what was on the back of his neck that raised the most questions. A series of black burn-like marks on his head, followed by another wound on the back of his neck that appeared to have been weeping. It also seemed that someone had tried to treat his burns. There was some sort of ointment applied to the wounds, a yellowy green cream that had been rubbed in. The man's clothes, despite as the police suspected being apparently placed on him after death, in a strangely haphazard way, were spotless, his shoes sparkling clean. It did not look like this man had crawled or been dragged through a dirty coal yard and up this huge pile of coal. It was as though he had just appeared there. But the thing that Alan Godfrey would remember most from that day was the man's face. This wasn't the first body Godfrey had seen, but it was the one that was seared into his memory for the rest of his life. Eyes open wide, mouth contorted. Alan would later say, it looked as though the man had been frightened to death. But this apparently wasn't a murder at all. The coroner would later identify the death as a seemingly natural one. The man had suffered a heart attack. The mystery deepened when the forensic experts attempted to analyse the substance that was smothered over the burns. The ointment couldn't be identified. It wasn't in any local or national pharmaceutical databases, not recognised by police toxicologists or forensic pathologists. In the words of the coroner, James Turnbull, much like the body, it was as if it had come from nowhere. It took the police a little while to identify the man, but it wasn't too long before they connected a missing person report from a town 20 miles away called Tigley. They had identified their mystery man. He was Zigmund Adamski, a 56-year-old coal miner, but Adamski hadn't been seen in 5 days. Zigmund was a Polish immigrant who had lived in England for many years at this point. He was well liked in his community, but mostly kept himself to himself. A miner in good health, he lived with his wife Lottie and was known as a quiet, dependable man. On the 6th of June 1980, he had left his home around 3:30 p.m. to run an errand. He told Lottie he was going to the local shops to buy potatoes. He left wearing a brown suit and a shirt. Seemingly, according to the report from the local shopkeeper, he did come into the shop that day. Zigmund made his purchase, left the shop, and then just didn't return home. There was no reason to suspect foul play at first. There was no history of mental illness, no debts, no enemies. He was carrying no luggage, no passport, no change of clothes. He'd simply vanished into thin air. In fact, Adamski was due to give away his goddaughter at her wedding the day after he disappeared. He had been excited about it, and even had his speech written for that day. Family had flown over from Poland to join in on the happy occasion. The timeline of his disappearance was thin and unsettling. On the 6th of June, Adamski left his home mid-afternoon. He disappeared after being seen in his local shop. Between the 7th of June and the 10th of June, there were no verified sightings, no leads. He missed his goddaughter's wedding, and a missing persons report was made. June 11th, his body was discovered 20 miles away in Todmorden, around 3:45 PM. That's it. 5 days completely unaccounted for. Yet when his body was examined further, the evidence told a strange story. He appeared clean and well fed, with no signs of exposure to the elements. His beard growth indicated he had shaved, or had been shaved, just a day before his death. When he left on the 6th, he had longer messy hair, but when his body was discovered he had a shortened crop haircut. He was wearing a vest that he didn't leave the house in on that day. The burn marks on his neck and head were days old, suggesting he had been alive for most of the time he was missing, a fact that was backed up by the coroner, who seemed to suggest that the heart attack had taken place not long before his body was discovered. The mysterious ointment applied to his wounds was still completely untraceable. The autopsy concluded that Zigmund Adamski had died of a heart attack sometime on the 11th of June, mere hours before his body was discovered. But beyond that, there were no clear answers. Where had he been for the previous 5 days? Why was his body so clean? Who dressed him? Who treated his wounds? And most puzzling of all, how did he end up on top of a 15-foot coal heap without disturbing a single piece of coal? There were no drag marks, no signs of struggle, no evidence of a fall or lift. It was as if he had been lowered from above. With no easy answers, the void quickly filled with speculation, and the longer the case remained unsolved, the weirder the ideas became. One of the earliest and most grounded theories was that Adamski had been abducted, or possibly held against his will. There were whispers of a family feud over a niece's marriage. Some speculated that Adamski had become entangled in a domestic drama involving a relative in the Polish immigrant community. The suggestion was that he might have been taken somewhere remote and held while the issue was dealt with. But this theory doesn't explain the lack of injuries, the unidentified ointment, or the condition of his body. He hadn't been beaten or tied up. He was fed, clean. His wounds were treated with care. And then there was the location of the body. If someone wanted to dispose of a body, they wouldn't gently place it on top of a coal pile in a public area during daylight hours, without leaving any trace of how they did it. Even the police admitted it didn't make sense, although a variation on this theory became one of the more widely accepted explanations. But we'll need to get into that a little later. There was the idea that this was somehow self-inflicted. Could Adamski have wandered off in a fugue state, suffered a breakdown, fallen in with strangers? Perhaps he had died of natural causes after an accident, or even taken his own life somehow. But that would raise more questions than it answered. Where did he go? Who took care of him? Where did he get the ointment? And still, how did his body end up so carefully placed in Todmorden? The official verdict remained: death by heart attack. Cause undetermined. Then the theories got more wild. Poland was firmly behind the Iron Curtain on the eastern side of the Cold War. Had Adamski gotten himself mixed up with operatives from the other side? Had someone who came over from the wedding wanted him to do something he wasn't happy with, to maybe betray his new country in some way? The conspiracies grew wilder and wilder, with some claiming this random coal miner in a quiet Yorkshire town had been assassinated by the KGB. But seemingly, other than him being from Poland, There wasn't too much to really delve into with this one. And then, there was the UFO theory. This was seemingly spurred on by the coroner's remarks about how if you had told him that Adamski had been dropped on the pile by a UFO, he would only raise one eyebrow. Whether he meant this literally or was simply making a remark about the unexplainable nature of how he got up there is up for debate. On the surface, it sounds ridiculous. A man goes missing, turns up dead, and people start blaming aliens. But consider the context. Todmorden and West Yorkshire in the late 1970s and early 80s were hotbeds for UFO sightings. Throughout 1979 and 1980, locals reported strange lights, metallic objects, and unexplained aerial phenomena across the Pennines. In fact, these reports would continue for years after the Adamski discovery, leading many to believe that something genuinely strange was going on in the area. Some believe Adamski was taken, experimented on and returned. The wounds, the ointment, the placement of the body, all part of a bizarre abduction process gone wrong. This should be the fringe theory, the silly one that most people don't put too much stock into. And that would very likely have been the case, if it wasn't for what would happen just 5 months later. The leads into the Adamski case dried up. No arrests were made and no one was ever able to explain what had happened to him. His wife took his body back to Poland, where he was buried, and seemingly she never returned. It was the 28th of November 1980, and Alan Godfrey was back on the beat. But this time, he was working a very different case. The police station had been inundated with calls that night about a herd of cows roaming through a residential area of the town. Godfrey drove around the streets on his own looking for them, but could find no sign of the cows. Assuming it was some sort of prank, he returned back to the station. But curiously, they then received an even stranger call. An elderly woman called up to say she had seen the herd of cows in her front garden and blocking the road out front. The operator asked the woman were the cows still there, preparing to send Godfrey back out to find them. But the old woman went quiet for a moment. The operator repeated the question. The old woman hesitated before answering, admitting that this was going to sound strange, but no, the cows were no longer there. The operator asked which direction they had walked off into. The woman said they hadn't. She had seen a flash of light coming from outside, a really bright flash, and then the cows were just gone. Calls about this rogue herd of cows continued throughout the night, and eventually, as his shift neared its end, Godfrey agreed to go out and do one final sweep for the animals. It was now around 5 AM. He was tired and likely frustrated that this silly issue had eaten up so much of his time and forced him out multiple times now on this rainy night. But it wasn't like there was much going on in Todmorden, at least not since Adamski was found. The town had fallen back into its normal, quiet routine. Alan jumped into his car and set off through the town. It was quiet, dark still, barely anyone was on the roads. He turned onto Burnley Road, a long stretch that led out of town, through the moors. An especially creepy place at night. The moors have always had a reputation. A vast expanse of moorland, without another human in sight. Alan later questioned what would have happened if he had just turned left that night instead of right. He wasn't going anywhere specific, just looking around. But that tiny decision completely changed the trajectory of his life. As Godfrey was driving through the moors, the rain began to clear. He thought to himself it was amazing how quickly the isolation had set in. Moments ago he was in the town, and now he was on this empty road. But it wasn't empty. There was a light up ahead. Curious, he drove closer towards it. But as he grew closer, he realised this wasn't just a light. Godfrey drove until he was just 20 yards from the object, before stopping his car in the middle of the road. He froze, unable to comprehend what he was looking at. He lifted up his radio to call the station, but was met only with static. This wasn't uncommon once you got out of the town, so instead he turned to the stronger radio in his police car. But again, he was met with nothing but static. He was alone. Just him and this thing. Next to Alan in the passenger seat of his car was a clipboard with a sheet of paper on it. He picked it up and began to draw what he was looking at. Something the police would have done back then when dealing with a traffic accident. The object in the road was hovering 5 feet off the ground, spinning in the centre of the road. It was diamond-shaped. Godfrey estimated that it was around 20 feet wide and 14 feet high. The object was dark and appeared to have some sort of black panelling across the top of it. He couldn't say if they were windows or not because he couldn't see into them. It didn't make a sound. He couldn't feel any vibrations from inside his car, but this thing was moving. It appeared to be spinning in an anti-clockwise direction. Below it, in the 5 feet of space above the ground, leaves and branches were flying through the air, curiously spinning clockwise, going against the movement of the object. Godfrey was furiously scrambling down as many details as he could when suddenly he heard a sound. A deep, loud whooshing. Then everything seemed to go white, just for a fraction of a second. Alan Godfrey was now driving down the road in the opposite direction. He didn't start driving. He didn't turn his car around. It was like he came to midway through doing this action. He was already 1,500 yards away from where he had been just a fraction of a second ago. Godfrey slammed on his brakes and looked into his mirror. The road behind him should have given a clear line of sight back to where the object was. But there was only darkness. Alan looked down at his watch. Half an hour had gone, where he was sure only 2 minutes could have passed. Godfrey was close enough to the town now, and he knew that no one would believe him if he just ran into the station with this wild story. He quickly found another police officer who was patrolling the area on foot, and asked him to come with him. As Godfrey promptly drove back to the site of the incident, he excitedly explained what he had seen to the other officer. The other man was skeptical at first, thinking that Godfrey was just messing with him. But then they arrived at the site and got out of the car. Sure enough, there was the debris of branches and leaves strewn all over the road, as though they had been blown over by some sort of strong storm. But other than a little rain, nothing like that had passed through. Then he spotted it. Right in the centre of the road. The ground all around was soaking wet with rainwater, but there was a spot in the centre of the road, around 20 foot across, that was bone dry. Next to this area of the road was a park. The gates faced out onto the road. The other officer, still unsure about Godfrey's story, suggested they should go and look inside. Maybe whatever it was he had seen had entered the park somehow. Maybe that was how it vanished from his view so quickly. The two men were forced to climb over a large fence as the gates were still locked at this time. Godfrey was skeptical that they would find anything in there. With a little difficulty, the two men hoisted themselves over and began to investigate. At first, nothing seemed amiss in the park. That was until the two officers walked past the rugby field. Standing there, in the middle of the locked field, was the herd of cows. The following day, Godfrey filed his report of what he had seen to his superiors. Every morning, the local newspaper would phone up the station to see if anything interesting had happened, and it appeared that someone at the station leaked Godfrey's encounter to them. Within a week, Alan's story was in the paper, and then it just snowballed from there. He did give an interview. It seems a little unclear if this was under the Chief Inspector's instructions, or if they had just given him permission to do it. But either way, his superiors had okayed Godfrey speaking to the press. But when the attention on the case grew, they appeared to have second thoughts. Some of his colleagues believed Alan. Others mocked him both to his face and behind his back. As the story went out to a wider and wider audience, the connection was quickly made that this was the same police officer who had investigated the Zigmund Adamski case and the theory that his death was somehow linked to a UFO became an inseparable part of his story. It seemed though that Godfrey wasn't the only witness that day. Numerous reports were made by other locals. A bus driver reported that he had just started his morning route when he was driving down the same stretch of road that Godfrey had been on only moments before. He stopped his bus suddenly when he noticed something strange in front of him. The driver stepped out of his vehicle and said that all around the road were the debris of nearby bushes and trees, as though they had been violently blown all over the road. He also noted that in the middle of the road was a patch of ground that was totally dry, despite everything else around it being wet. As he stood in this area, he said he felt something strange, like a kind of updraft of air, not like wind as such, just as though the air were moving up from the ground to about the height of his neck. He thought it was strange, but just got back into his bus and drove on. He never really questioned it too much until reading Godfrey's account later. Then there was a school caretaker who was opening up at the local school building that day. He spotted something in the corner of his eye in the pre-dawn darkened sky. He looked up to see a light in the valley, just a little further away. He didn't know it at the time, but where he was looking was the same stretch of road that Godfrey had his sighting. The caretaker said he saw this strange light shoot from one end of the valley to the other, and then back again. This repeated 4 times before it just shot off into the air at an insanely fast speed. The most credible of all, though, were the other police officers. Now there seems to be some confusion on if this took place on the same night as Godfrey's encounter, or if it had been the previous evening. But a group of 5 police officers were searching the moors late that night, looking for a motorcycle thief. Apparently it wasn't uncommon for teenagers to steal a bike and ride it around the desolate moors, but as the group were out that night searching, they saw something that they at first thought could be the headlights of the bike, but there was something off about it. It was blue, and more importantly, it appeared to be floating through the sky, lowly above the tree line of a nearby forest. They got a good look at the light before it appeared to just zip off into the distance, in a flash. They could never explain what it was they saw that night. Numerous UFO investigators got involved in the case, and one group seemingly convinced Godfrey to undergo hypnotic regression with 2 psychiatrists to see if they could figure out what had happened during his lost period of time. What emerged was chilling. Under hypnosis on 3 separate occasions, Godfrey described the events of that night. They filmed these sessions. Alan claims he didn't remember what he said under hypnosis, but they did eventually play the tape back to him. In the video, Alan is laying down with his eyes shut. He says he can see a light up ahead. He thinks it's a bus, bringing workers to the mill, but then he says, "It's not a bus," in a curious tone. Suddenly, Alan throws his hands up across his face and begins screaming about a light, clearly terrified. The next thing Alan says is that he is inside the object. Inside, he saw a room with brilliant white walls, lit from nowhere. He was met by a humanoid being called Yosef. Tall, bearded, dressed in a long robe and wearing what looked like a skull cap. Beside him were small mechanical creatures, about the size of children, with large black eyes and heads shaped like light bulbs. At different points he refers to them as creatures, while at others he calls them robots. They laid him on the table, which Alan resisted at first but quickly gave in, before they started to do things to him. Things that Alan can't really explain. The strangest detail of all is one of the last that Alan recalls. He remembers turning around while laying on the bed and seeing sat there, staring at him, a large black dog. Things got stranger still for Alan Godfrey when he received a letter that had been sent from Moscow. It was from a man who identified himself as a Professor Zakharov. The professor was asking Godfrey to provide him with any information he could about his sighting. And strangely, Also anything he may know about a similar event that had just happened in Surrey. Godfrey didn't know it at the time, but his sighting had taken place just 1 month before the most infamous UFO sighting in British history, the Rendlesham Forest incident. I have an entire episode on that case that I will link in the description, so I won't get into it in detail now, but essentially across 2 nights in late 1980, military personnel at 2 Air Force bases further south in England claimed to witness a UFO incident, with at least 2 men claiming to have close contact with a mysterious craft that didn't sound drastically dissimilar to what Godfrey had seen. There are also a few other connections too, including the lost time. Godfrey was understandably cautious about responding to this Russian professor, so he was shocked when he was told by his superiors to send a letter back. In fact, they encouraged him to respond to the professor multiple times, under the instruction that they be allowed to see what Zakharov replied with each time. Not long after this, Godfrey met the man from the ministry for the first time. One day, Alan was called into his chief inspector's office, but when he entered, he realised he wasn't alone. Sat at the far end of the table was a man he didn't recognise. When Godfrey asked who he was, he simply said, "All you need to know is, I am the man from the ministry." He didn't elaborate any further. The man was holding a thick file, and when he opened it, Godfrey saw that his sketch of the object was in there. He was informed he should not talk to the media again. He should stop talking about what he had seen. And curiously, the man stated that he also should not talk any further about Zigmund Adamski. The man from the ministry showed up repeatedly after this, seemingly attempting to intimidate Godfrey, showing that he could follow him anywhere. When he showed up one day in Godfrey's local pub, Alan quite matter-of-factly told the man to leave him alone, seemingly after some time realising that the intimidation wasn't working, or that Godfrey wasn't a threat to whatever they were trying to keep quiet. The man did leave him alone. Alan Godfrey's life began to crumble. The Yorkshire police force was already under a great deal of scrutiny for their handling of the Yorkshire Ripper case, and this insane story of a UFO being linked to another death that they couldn't solve was publicity they didn't want. Godfrey felt like they were trying to push him out of his job, reassigning him from his usual roles, generally making a mockery of him, making him seem crazy and unfit to serve in the police force. Godfrey turned to drink. He said at his lowest point he was putting away a bottle of whiskey every day. His marriage fell apart. He lost his home. His professional career ruined. He felt like a laughingstock, that his community had turned on him. But despite this, Godfrey never wavered on his story. To this day, he stands by what he saw on the road that night. And over the years that followed, as more and more people saw lights in the sky over Todmorden, more and more people began to believe him. Sightings became so common that a support group was set up in the local area to allow witnesses a safe space to discuss their experiences with one another. Godfrey questions why, when the MOD released most of their UFO files to the public, his account was not included. Freedom of Information Act requests have been put in, but with no luck. Some have said that Godfrey's report he first gave was destroyed shortly after the attention began. To this day, many speculate about this case. Was Adamski connected to these sightings at all? Was Godfrey's experience genuine? As more and more people come forward, however, it seems to suggest that something is happening. Maybe not aliens, maybe not UFOs, but there are many that believe that out there, on the moors surrounding the town of Todmorden, that something truly unexplainable was lurking in the darkness, and maybe, just maybe, it's still there. So what really happened? We've already discussed most of the major theories involving Adamski's death, but there was one interesting one I dug up that backed up the idea that he was killed by someone connected to his family. A couple of years back, the podcast Astonishing Legends performed an interview with British UFO expert Philip Mantle about the case. Philip had grown up in Tigley, and both he and his father had actually known Adamski. While he believes Godfrey's sightings from 5 months later, he does not believe the two cases are connected in any way, that it's simply the words of the coroner and the strange coincidence of Godfrey being involved in both that keeps people coming back to them. Apparently, the generally accepted theory at the time from many of the coal miners that worked with Adamski was that he was having some personal issues with his wife. She apparently wanted to move back to Poland, but Adamski was very against this idea. When a few of her family came over for the wedding, they attempted to pressure the man into moving back to Poland. The theory is they took this a little too far, essentially kidnapping the man. During the 5 days they held him, they took care of him but wouldn't let him leave until he agreed to come back to Poland with them. It is believed that Adamski was being kept in a shed and that he tried to escape. In the struggle, knocking over tins of some sort of substance that burned his skin. The men who held him captive had tried to treat his wounds, but in all the stress of the incident, Adamski had a heart attack. The men had driven him far away from his home to Todmorden, where they disposed of his body in the coal yard. By the time the police were able to identify the body, the men had already fled back to Poland. This theory was given more weight when Mantle was working at the headquarters of the Yorkshire UFO Society in Leeds, just a couple of years later. A woman had called up, claiming to be the niece of Adamski, and laid out the story in this exact manner. The man who took the phone call urged the woman to call the police, but they never heard from her again. This detail feels odd to me. The woman on the phone never gave her name, nor the names of the men responsible for Adamski's death. She had also gone out of her way to track down the contact details of this small UFO investigators group, rather than approaching the authorities, leading some to speculate that this is simply someone trying to sow disinformation, although it is still regarded as the most realistic theory. As for Alan Godfrey's sighting, he stands by exactly what he reported, and will still tell his story to this day if people ask him. He even wrote a book later in his life that he sells directly from his own website, detailing his accounts in his own words. He does, however, not put a lot of weight personally into what he said during his hypnotic regression sessions. Godfrey admits that this happened a while after his sighting, and during the following months he had read up extensively on UFO topics, most notably the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, and he doesn't know what elements of what he recalls were his own memories, and what parts could simply be the stories of others that he had consumed in the wake of his experience. The most commonly used explanation to debunk this story is the Futuro house. A futuristic looking round house that was displayed in Todmorden during the 1970s, standing a few feet off the ground on legs and with windows all around the top. It's hard to argue that this thing doesn't look like a UFO, and fairly close to Alan's UFO at that. However, Alan Godfrey would have seen this building countless times before. It was located by the police station, so he likely would have passed it on a daily basis multiple times in the years prior to his experience. So it feels unlikely he would have mistaken the house for something else. It also doesn't really explain a lot of the other elements of Godfrey's encounter. Of course, if he were making the story up though, it could have given him the inspiration for how the craft in his story should look. Godfrey has been very clear about this detail over the years though. He says that what he saw was not the Futuro house. He has no doubt in his mind about that. Regardless of what you believe in terms of UFOs and what Alan Godfrey and others claim to have seen, one simple undeniable fact remains. Zigmund Adamski's death is unsolved. No one knows how or why he ended up laying on that pile of coal, his face contorted, his eyes wide open, frozen in pure terror. That's all for this entry into the tape library. As always, please do let me know your theories on this case. There are so many different directions you can go with this one, so I'm really intrigued to see where your mind takes you. Leave me a comment below and let me know what you think happened here. As I said, this is a story I've known about since I was just a kid, but for some reason it just kept slipping my mind when thinking of episodes to do. I was actually writing about a totally different British cold case for this episode, but I was really struggling to write it, and then suddenly the Adamski case popped into my head, so I tore up the previous episode idea and delved into this, and I'm so pleased I did. It really does have it all as far as stories go, and I just love all the really odd little details surrounding it, like the vanishing cows in the rugby field, or the vision of the black dog, which plays a really prominent part in a lot of British folklore, and of course the mystery of how Zigmund Adamski ended up on a coal pile with no trace of evidence as to how he reached the peak. I've got a really fun mix of topics coming up in the coming weeks and months for you all, from poltergeists to urban legends, and maybe even another haunted lake episode. So if you don't want to miss out on any of those, please do click subscribe. And if you enjoyed this episode, clicking like on YouTube or leaving me a rating on your favourite podcast platform is a really easy way to support the show. Speaking of support, it's time to thank all our wonderful Patreon supporters who keep the show running. Our tape library archivists Umiko Grimm, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Wen Senior, Tina Est, Crimson DM, The Detective, Sirius Wax, Stephen Lutman, Sean Miller, Sandy Lusk, Sag El Kali, Restock 1731, Quirky Joseph, Pixelina, Peter McCann, Monty Montes, Mirashard, Midia Zabine, Emmy Bartley, Lady Bet Noir, Juno, Judith Hacker, Joseph Corndella, Jolly Jedi, Joe, G-Raw, Gabrielle, Eric Salas, Dagon O'Dorleg, Dominic DeAngelis, Dawn Swan, Darla, Crystal Edwards, Ash Loves Books, Alfredo Sandoval and Adeline. Our lead archivists, Xavier Rangel, Van Yell, Tyler Michael, Tracy Torello, The Original Deer, Ridiculous, Old Soul Like Mine, Plague Doctor Is In, Melissa Harrison, Law William, London Grace, Creepy Candy, Brian Baker, Amy Stubblefield, Alex O'Neill, Alex Goldberg and 1000th Ghost. And to our very generous Grand Overseers, the God Emperor of Mankind, Morning Rain 2619, Leah Carmella, Katie, Harrison the Yoga Lord, Bad Diddle, Agent 355 and the returning Queen of Flatulence. As always, a huge thank you to them, all my junior archivists on Patreon, and my members on YouTube. All your contributions play a huge part in making this show what it is. And thank you to you especially for making it to the end of this episode. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.